Hello, everyone. This is Pete Tigers, and this is the Fly Culture podcast. Music has always been important to me. Soul music from Detroit, Georgia, Philadelphia, the reggae and ska from Kingston, and latterly Coventry and Birmingham. They've really been the soundtrack to my life. Last night, though, I watched a film shot in 1972, and it was where Aretha Franklin sang in a church in California. The crowd was mainly the congregation, although I did spot Mick Jagger and Charlie Watts in the background as well. But it was a stripped back and simple setup, and she only sang gospel songs as well. She sang from the heart. It was absolutely amazing. And you probably ask me, well, where does this come into it? But it's also the strip back from the soul part makes me think about fly fishing a little bit from that sense as well, and how I'm looking at fly fishing and not getting overly technical about things, just enjoying it, enjoying my home water, and looking forward to that. And when we can fish, I can't really fish right now because the grayling fishing's a little bit too far for me, so I'm not going to be fishing for a bit. But I know that I'm going to be hitting my home water. I know I'm probably going to look and hang on for some rising trout, cast some simple flies and fish that way. And that seems to be the undercurrent that I seem to be getting from people, be it they're fishing bamboo rods or glass rods or whatever it is, or just waiting for that rising fish rather than prospecting water. So it's going to be really interesting to see how we come out the other side of this. And this is a really, really interesting segue for me because it comes on to my podcast guest for today really, really nicely. And I first got to know Andy Baird via his excellent blog, The Small Fly Funk. And he's championed the use of small flies for fishing. And I'm pleased to say he's also written for Fly Culture, appearing in the very first edition. And I think we were probably one of the first fishing magazines in the UK to actually carry a mixtape, which Andy provided with the article as well. So that's tied everything really nicely together. And I can see the background there. There's a great big Sonic Youth poster behind him as well. And it seems as though music is a big part of his life. And in that first piece that he wrote for us, that he talked about vinyl as well and records and the importance of that to his collection as well. So we're going to talk about fishing, obviously, but it would be rude of me not to chat a little bit about fishing latterly, but we're going to talk a little bit about music first. Andy, it's great to have you on the Fly Culture podcast. Thanks for dropping by.
Good morning. Yes, great to see you, Pete. So thank you for the warm invitation and the introduction there.
And it's been really interesting, hasn't it? With that first, I've sort of flicked through the first copy of Fly Culture, which is a collector's item now because we've sold out of it.
Yes.
But that mixed tape that you did, it sounds as though we're sort of veering on similar musical tastes and then sort of veering away again. But it's been kind of interesting to have a read through that list again. And I guess music's really, really important to you too, isn't it?
Yeah, it's always been there. I think fishing and music were both things that I discovered probably, I don't know, 8 or 9, something like that. And I guess it kind of happened at about the same time. So I guess the first recording artist that I got really serious about, although she doesn't feature on the mixtape, was Kate Bush, and it's thanks to an English teacher. We were reading Wuthering Heights, and at around that time, Wuthering Heights, the single, came out, and so I'd sort of discovered Kate Bush. At the same time, I was just sort of dipping my toe into fishing as well. So the two have always kind of gone together. Music has always followed me to the stream, followed me home from the stream, been there on the background when I'm tying flies. And the two are just very complementary. They're just nice things to have in your life. I guess everyone has a level of interest in music. A bit like the fishing, I got kind of quite seriously into it. And as you've probably seen from the mixtape, it's sort of quite diverse as well. So whilst I have some very focused areas of interest, my view on music is I just like all good music, and I don't mean that sort of flippantly. I mean, that includes pop music. There's some amazing pop music around. I mean, I have a huge collection of original ABBA vinyl. I'm a huge fan of ABBA, and part of it is because they knew what they were doing. Benny and Bjorn, they didn't have a very sort of random approach to chords and melody. It was very scientific. It was like engineering. they knew how to put chords together in such a way as to generate a real reaction from their audience. So I would say don't write ABBA off. It's serious stuff, even though it is pop music.
I think everyone really does like ABBA. Perhaps they don't always admit it.
They don't want to admit it.
Yeah. It's interesting, before we delve into fishing, it's interesting you talk about, because I sort of play a little bit. I'm absolutely terrible, but I enjoy it. But their sort of music's actually quite complex in the structure, whereas the music I'm talking about, be it Motown, be it Stax, it may be a 145 CF and G, say, or AD and E for the reggae songs a lot. And I think it is often just it is a catchy melody and a chorus that grabs you, and that's it. And that's the interesting thing. When I was thinking about this morning, that how that sort of music has lasted the test of time. Against that, we watched a thing. It was an old Top of the Pops from the 1990s, and I thought, God, what a load of rubbish. There was some good stuff in there, but it was music that sort of disappeared really, really quickly. And it's the longevity, isn't it? That it, like you say, your children understand mixtapes, and my daughter listens. She's a little bit older again, but she'll listen to anything from the Beach Boys via wherever that may be. And it's a lot more diverse, and it's kind of interesting to look at music in that way now, isn't it? And I guess it's easier to be accessible as well, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you mentioned the 90s there. Certainly in terms of pop music, I think the 90s was a pretty awful decade. And yet, in many respects, there was amazing things happening in the 90s. I mean, I was born 1970, and I remember just before I left Leicester, I was working in, it's still going, the Fan Club. Back then, it was very much an alternative club. And the house music scene was just starting to happen. So we put on what was probably Leicester's first sort of legal rave, in that it was sort of a club environment. And that really kick-started something that matured very, very quickly in the 90s, and some amazing things were happening. But it tended to be a little bit more underground, in that it wasn't sort of the mainstream. The 80s as a decade was amazing as well, and particularly pop music. I think a lot of what's lost of what we were doing in the 80s, or bands were doing in the 80s, was just the amazing production standards. And in an age where so much music is listened on sort of smart speakers and what have you, I think we've missed out on actually just some of the amazing stuff that was happening back then. I mean, if you listen to a Duran Duran album now, the production standards are breathtaking, albeit you need to listen to it on a decent system in order to get the full frequency range and understand what the producers put together. But no, it's an interesting decade, both of them. And pretty much, I guess, where I was, certainly the 90s, when I was moving away from my fishing as well, what with studying and sort of other distractions. So they've always both been there, but maybe at times there's been a bit more fishing, less music, sometimes all music and no fishing.
Yeah, I found for fishing that I like listening to music on the way to fishing, and then often I'll turn it off on the way back, because I'm almost in a sort of reflective mood, I guess, in some respects, and thinking about the day and how it's unfolded and what happened and hatches and everything else that went with that. Are you similar, or you like it on the way back as well?
It's usually there and back, and interestingly, there are certain pieces of music that do take me to very specific fishing experiences, more in terms of, as I say, just more the general sort of feel of fishing. So yeah, I would say on the way back as well. I mean, I do tend to get very reflective on the way back. I mean, for me, fishing has always been partly a distraction, certainly an escape, but there is an almost sort of yoga quality to it. I mean, that for me is what I'm always pursuing. It's that absolute serenity, and fishing is such a key tool to enable you to do that. Factor in as well the fresh air, the sound of water. It's just that's certainly the way I would approach it anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. And fishing at the moment, have you been able to fish, or have you been able to get out, or a grayling on your radar? Or are you able to get to grayling in any way, shape or form?
Yeah, I mean, it's not been great. It hasn't been for anyone. I mean, I'm based North Coast, County Antrim in Northern Ireland, so we have very much a spring, summer, autumn fishing season. There's no grayling, there's no chub, so we're quite limited. So this is very much my fly tying season, albeit it hasn't really got up and running this year. But no, I mean, literally as the season got going last year, obviously everything went into lockdown. We missed the best part of the season. Roy Christie and myself did stand on the banks of the River Bush and sort of have a short interview with BBC Radio Ulster around sort of March, April time, because they were wanting to hear what the health benefits of fishing were at a time of lockdown. And it was so frustrating because that particular day, I can't remember, it was either late March or early April, but the conditions were absolutely perfect. It was sort of dull, overcast, drizzly, quite close. We were having to stand there as trout were rising next to us, concentrating on an interview, when all we were thinking was we really should be fishing, albeit strictly speaking, we weren't supposed to at that time. It was one of those activities that was deemed not approved under the lockdown measures. I did get out just before lockdown. I mean, every season, even last year when I didn't get out so much, every season has those days of pure magic, and I, at least pre-lockdown, managed to get a day out. The River Bush is basically my home water. It enters at the sea, sort of travels across primarily North Antrim, and the header is the dam that was sort of built way back in the 50s. So whilst I spent a fair bit of time on the main river, most of my interest and activity over the last sort of 15 years or so has been just looking at an OS map, tracking all of those tributaries, and just finding smaller, ideally unfished water. So there's a particular stream that I head to, probably 2 to 3 times a year. Never more than that, because it's a hard walk in, and it's getting more dangerous. I guess I turned 50 in October of last year. I'm maybe not as nimble as I once was, but I did manage to get sort of 3 or 4 hours on this particular stream, and so it was just a beautiful day, cloudless, warm. There was a few fish around. I say you probably best case sort of 9 or 10 inches on this stream. And it's right at the head of the system, and it was one of those few occasions that I didn't take bamboo. I've actually got one of the hardy 5-foot 2 weight ounds, which is quite a limited rod. It has its applications, and in the right applications, it's a dream. It's an absolute dream. But that's the rod I tend to fish on this particular stream. And it literally transports you to Colorado and to a backcountry mountain stream in Colorado. And it's also one of the few stretches of our system where there is almost no litter and sort of general pollution, which is becoming a major issue on the main river. So I kind of count my blessings that I did get out at the beginning of the season, had a wonderful couple of hours. The rest of the year was okay, but it is what it is. And I think everyone was pretty much in the same boat. But unfortunately, there's no winter sport to be had.
That's a great term, looking at the OS maps that I've learned relatively recently, blue lining. And it's been a really interesting to hear you mention that as well. And I'm already, and I'm sure the listeners are doing exactly the same, sort of closing my eyes and thinking about that stream. And I'm imagining not very wide because it's a short rod, and pocket water perhaps.
Yeah. I mean, it's tiny. This is fishing in a microcosm, which I guess is very much the theme of small fly funk. It's taking everything to its logical and practical sort of minimal scale, and it's sort of lots of boulders, lots of rocks, lots of gravel, because it's just naturally, it's basically a stream that's carved its way through the geology over millions of years. And I say in places it's quite dangerous, and maybe 10 years ago I would be a little bit more nimble, and it's a hard walk out as well. You pretty much have a sort of a sheer bank to climb, and it's probably 30-40 meters drop from the road, but it is magical, and that's the kind of thing I'm always looking for. I mean, only this summer I was given permission to fish a further 3/4 of a mile right at the top of that system. Now, I haven't fished it yet. I've walked it at length. There's certainly trout in it. But the farmer who owns the land has assured me no one's fished it for sort of 25 years. There's a couple of guys locally that used to nip in. And he actually does go down from time to time and move a few things around. So he'll sort of move a few boulders around with his digger. He'll sort of clear any debris, but it looks stunning. And I'm kind of drawn to the idea that maybe the trout haven't seen a fly for a couple of decades. So that's certainly a target for next year. And I think next year my focus will be very much stay away from the familiar waters. I mean, there's any number of places within a 20-minute cycle ride, a 5-minute drive from here, where I know where I can catch fish in the right conditions. This year is probably going to be about being a little bit more exploratory, because there's an awful lot of water I sort of drive past, just in terms of going about sort of day-to-day work and business and what have you. There's an awful lot that I've yet to fish, so I think that will be my focus this year. Just go and find those new waters, because I don't know about you, Pete. It's a while since I've fished a lot of new water, but there's that real buzz you get from sussing out a new stream, working your way in, lots of observation, and just the joy of actually taking a trout in unfamiliar territory is great. When I say take a trout, I don't mean take a trout. I mean sort of at least get a strike everything. I've always been very rigorously sort of catch and release, more because I've come from a coarse fishing background, and the idea of saving coarse fish, it happens, but it's so I always return.
Yeah, it's really, I'm fascinated to think about this stream some more as well. And somebody said to me, my friend Gerald, the other day, he said, and I still, and I'm old enough to know better, I will still shake with excitement if I'm fishing a new place and it feels right. And he said, I love watching you. He said, you're like a kid sometimes because you're so excited about fishing somewhere new or somewhere different, or even just being there. And I think that's part of it as well, isn't it? And, the added bonus of this new water that you're thinking about, plus us not being able to go fishing right now, it sort of gives you time to think about these places a little bit more, doesn't it? And almost sort of build them up in your mind as well. But I wanted to come on to, we're going to come on obviously to the small flies in a minute, but in introduction, I talked a little bit about stripped back fishing, and it seems to be, as I said, something that a lot of people are talking to me about, and I know you've talked about this for a long time via your blog and everything else, and you just previously mentioned about fishing with your bamboo rod and everything else that goes with that. I guess you're firmly in that camp as well, aren't you?
Yeah, I think coming from a coarse fishing background, it's very much a case of you are posted in a peg. There's an awful lot of equipment that needs to get transported from A to B. So when I discovered fly fishing, it was very attractive just from the idea that it's highly mobile. And I mean, I literally have this Carhartt satchel. That is I've never used a vest. I pretty much wear the clothes I would wear ordinarily with just a pair of waders over the top. And that's one of the things that's very, very appealing. I just like this idea of how minimal can you make something in the interest of just simplicity. And it's been exactly my same approach to sort of business as well. Just strip everything away and just get to the bare essentials. Because I do think fly fishing, more than possibly any other kind of fly fishing, is emotive and it's cerebral. So stripping away all of those layers of complexity. I mean, the writers are our friends in the US. The writers have often written about sort of, traveling light and stripping everything back and having to go through the process of having all of that gear to learn that you didn't really need it. So for that is part of the joy for me. I mean, my ideal is if I can go away with literally just, or get out with just a fly box, some tippet, some forceps, and the absolute essentials, then it kind of doesn't get any better than that. And certainly in terms of the sort of fishing, I mean, the reality is I could probably get through the season with just a handful of flies. I mean, I tend to be fairly careful. I tend not to lose too many flies, not least I'm not a fast fly tyer. It takes a while to put them together. So I'm quite protective of them when I'm on stream. But no, that's just part of, I guess, the piece of fly fishing, just sort of strip it all away. I mean, I would rarely use a net either. I mean, I would rarely use catch a fish big enough to even justify a net. But particularly on these streams where you're covering quite a lot of ground. It's fairly challenging ground. That helps as well in terms of just being nimble. I mean, I took your recommendation in terms of my wading boots. I went sort of a lighter weight, those hopper boots, just so that it's more like a walking boot to aid me when I'm out and about. But no, I don't like complexity, and I apply exactly the same with my fly tying. Strip everything back to the absolute bare essentials, and even then, look for ways to take things sort of further back. And even my approach to fishing now, I mean, I pretty much have fished the same single rod pretty much all season for probably the last 5 years now. And part of that simplicity as well is just about focus and familiarity. And I guess expertising, I think, is a John Girac phrase he came up with in a very narrow sort of branch of our sport. I mean, one comment I would make, Pete, is fishing for me is purely recreation. It's not commerce, it's not business, it's never been a professional activity for me. So I really like to sort of focus, and time is relatively limited. I've only got so much time I can commit to fishing. So when I sort of first discovered fishing, only when I moved here, as I say, I mean, I've been fly fishing for less than 20 years. I figured very quickly, well, rather than try and sort of cover a whole range of different types of water and techniques, just learn those local waters, because I am very lucky. As I say, we have got some issues with pollution and sort of water quality in some areas, but I'm very lucky in terms of what's on the doorstep. And it just made sense, rather than try and sort of cover too many bases, just focus and refine on this one thing. And then when I discovered that small hooks and small flies were a feature of fly fishing, in a way that they were in coarse fishing way back in the late 70s and the 80s, it was like I may just have found my thing. Because I didn't fly fish in the 80s and the 90s. The Midlands, my assessment of the Midlands in the 70s and the 80s is it was a trout desert. Certainly in terms of wild trout, we had the heavy industries through the 60s and the 70s destroyed a lot of water. So your only real option was to sort of go out with a sort of onto the canals and try and catch fish that way. Albeit that morphed very, very quickly. So I started out sort of fishing competitively. I learnt what I was doing and joined the Leicester Angling Society, or the Leicester Lads as we were known. Notorious in the 70s and the 80s, we basically won everything. But I was probably around 12 or 13, and suddenly the competition just seemed to be the most important thing. So I was out fishing every single day. We would fish matches at the weekends, and literally Monday through Friday, we would be on the canals, essentially training. And I don't know what shifted, but the competition thing seemed to be the most important thing. And that's when I discovered small streams and went off and did my own thing. So what I do now in terms of fly fishing is very much what I was doing in the 80s. It's just the water's different and the technique is different. And people often sort of, there's sometimes been a bit of tension maybe between coarse fishing and fly fishing. But I would say the sort of coarse fishing I was doing with sort of shorter rods, tiny stick floats, fishing small streams with a sort of a tiny brandling, it required the same focus on presentation, on delicacy and appreciation of the environment that is very much the case with small flies and small streams and fly fishing.
Yeah, it sounds almost like a natural progression, really, doesn't it, for you and the fishing you love and I love. And we've sort of mentioned the small flies a little bit, and the blog, the Small Fly Funk, was that early days of blogging. And I've talked to other people, Gareth Lewis, for example, now yourself, and other people who were doing blogs very early on, talking about it, and it seemed as though you were really championing the use of small flies. And how did that come about? How did you suddenly think, okay, I get the small stream thing with the fly rod, and then how did the small flies? Was that again a natural progression from what you were doing, or how did that actually come about for you?
Well, I was looking to be able to do with a fly rod the kinds of things I enjoyed without a fly rod. And in the 80s, we were using 22, 24, 26 spade end hooks and focused on very, very delicate presentations. So when I moved over here, I just visited the local tackle shop and asked the question, where can I find some small streams where I can trot a stick float on a £3 sort of line with maybe a 1.5 pound tippet and find some chub? And I was informed there are no chub in Ireland. That water exists, but you would fish it with a fly rod. And that was my introduction. So I basically picked up a cheap 20, £30 fly rod, headed into the village. I hadn't a clue about casting. I hadn't a clue about flies. I had this size 16 black pennel, but I did know fish and I kind of knew how to fish. And on that first night out, after dark, I caught this sort of honest 12-inch brown trout from the village. It was the first time I'd handled a trout, and I was a little bit mesmerized. I was used to the sort of the coarser feel of the scales on a coarse fish, and this live torsional body in the water. I was just mesmerized, and I just went home that evening thinking, no, I've discovered this, but does it go small? Does it go intimate? And we still had the internet sort of back then. This would have been, I guess, 2002, 2003, something like this. And it didn't take long to learn that actually small flies and fishing small flies has been around for decades, like the 70s. I mean, it's why we have the Vince Marinaro K1A hook in 24, 26 and 28. So I'd kind of found my home, and then I guess it was just the focus then of spending a couple of years just sort of researching, speaking to different people. I wrote a letter to Ed Engel because I'd sort of bought his books, and that started a long conversation that continues to this day. But it felt very comfortable, and it felt very natural to me, that idea of scaling things down. And even to this day, I rarely fish bigger than a 20. And it's not about necessarily applying a particularly tactical approach to the local conditions. It's just because that's what I do and that's what I like. And it's pretty fishing. I mean, that was a Vince Marinaro term. It is very much pretty fishing. And it's not just about the small flies. It's about fine tippet and relatively short and relatively light rods and relatively small water. Because for me, that's where it all just feels very balanced and very natural. I'm not suggesting for a minute that you can't sort of use a 9'5" weight rod and cast a 28 to a trout and catch it. But for me, everything feels very balanced in the small water, the generally shorter and lighter rods, and the tiny flies. And it just became a passion, and it was very encouraging that so many other people were into it. And it does tend to ebb and flow a little bit, but it's always been there, and I think it always will be there. And it's an important part, I think, of if people are serious about sort of a tactical approach to fishing, having some small flies. I would argue you probably never need to go much smaller than 24, albeit I can only speak in terms of my experience, in terms of my home waters. But it's an important part, I think, of everyone's toolkit to have a few 24s, because there are those cases where a small fly is all that a trout will take. But for me, that's what I do. The only time I would maybe move away from that is when we are on a falling water. I do love to fish a very traditional and very, very sparse Thunder Creek minnow. And they're all 14s. They're just on the old Mustad streamer hooks. I've got a pile of these things that will last me the rest of my days. It's just a strong hook that just sits right. And if you tie the Thunder Creek just right, so literally the tail is at the bend of the hook, it's a very pretty sparse thing. Apart from that, it's primarily 18s, 20s and below. And to my eyes, and again, it's based on the local streams, the local hatches that we see, a 20 can appear a pretty big fly on our waters. And there's an awful lot you can do with a 20 hook as well, in terms of presenting an attractive meal source to the trout. I just love the aesthetics of the small. It's just something, again, a bit mesmerising about seeing a 26 or a 28 pretty fly just floating on the water. And I say floating, I do a little bit of nymphing, but it's mainly surface and just subsurface. I'm not a fan of weight. I don't know whether it's a bamboo thing, in that I don't want to be sort of clipping a bead on my rod blank. But I'm not a fan of weight. I love the weightlessness of a dry fly. So it's 20 and below, primarily on the surface, with just a few things going on the fringes when the conditions are more sort of suitable.
And that brings me nicely on, because what I'm hoping with this podcast is that it kind of inspires people to think about fishing possibly some smaller flies. And I've done it in the past, and I have, canis, and having fished in the States as well. And I'm sure we'll talk about this, trico patterns. And like you say, they're a really important food source for the fish as well. And we'll come on to this in a second. I wonder if part of it is being able to spot it on the water as well. And we'll come on to, perhaps I'll ask you a little bit about that. But I would say to people, if they're thinking about fishing small flies, to have a look at Andy's blog, but the book he mentions here as well, Fishing Small Flies by Ed Engel, is really excellent. And he's written a series of books, hasn't he, in Splitting Cane as well, I'm a big fan of. I think that's a wonderful book too. But that gives a really interesting insight into fishing these sorts of patterns. But I guess circling round then to what I was just saying was, do you think people are a little bit not as keen to fish smaller patterns because of spotting them on the water? Do you think that may be part of it, perhaps?
Yeah, I think that's probably the main issue. That said, even your 24s and 26s can be highly visible. Part of it, I guess, depends on range. I tend to fish at close range, so the sort of fishing ranges I can even work with a 32 and see it. Another big issue, and I think the biggest challenge of fishing small flies, particularly in the very small flies, is unhooking. That's the real challenge. The tying isn't such an issue. It's exactly the same approach as a larger. It's just scaled down. And I guess people have a certain level of, just confidence if they have visual contact with the fly. But there's plenty of tricks we all use in terms of if you've lost visual contact, in terms of just spotting the general area. But I would just say it is all the fears about fishing and tying small flies are purely psychological. They don't actually exist. And if you can tie a fly and you can fish a fly, then you can do it in a smaller scale. You just may need to have to adjust some of the details. So I would say certainly the ideal in terms of fishing at very, very close range, if you do need to maintain that sort of visual contact. But there's plenty of materials now. I mean, I'm not a fan of it personally in terms of just purely the aesthetics, but fluorescent poly yarn, etc., that certainly against a dark background, this thing just illuminates, whether it's the orange and the pink. I think they're generally the colours that work very well. I tend to stick with just sort of white and typical wing-coloured materials. But again, a lot of places where I'm fishing, there is canopy, there is a backdrop. So that black or darker sort of background means that sort of a typical white winged fly actually becomes very, very visible. But I would say just give it a go, because I say it's just good fun. And there's a lot of people, I mean, I say the magazines from time to time, there's lots of articles and there's lots of people writing about this stuff out there. So we know it's good fun and we know that it works as well. The key thing is the unhooking. I mean, I use a small pair of forceps in terms of unhooking. I've never tried the ketchup tool, but various disgorgers and what have you can work, albeit my idea when I'm fishing, all fishing, but particularly the small flies, if I can get a strike, and if I can get a hook up and I can bring a fish to hand and it slips the hook literally at your feet, that for me is a perfect outcome, because then I don't need to handle the fish and I don't need to deal, because certainly when you're getting down to sort of 28, 30 and 32, they're just not easy hooks to remove from any trout. And that's where maybe a net is required. So you can just literally rest the fish and just work out how on earth you're going to sort of extract a hook. One thing I would say though, in terms of, I guess, a pitch for small fishing small flies, is my experience is the hookup ratio with small hooks, and particularly tiny hooks, is really, really good. And I'm guessing it's just because they are so small and sharp, it doesn't take much to sort of get purchase. So I tend to find if you get a strike, unless it's literally the thing has not actually taken the fly into its mouth, hookup rates are really, really good. And if you do introduce a slight offset into the bend as well, that helps. I mean, the K1A featured that as standard on all of my straight or straight pattern hooks. I would tend to just give them a little nudge at the vise just to slightly open the point. But that's been my experience. I've had far fewer sort of missed strikes using smaller flies than sort of when I'm in the 18, 20, 22 range.
There's some great points.
So I think it's just because they're so tight.
There's some great points there, and literally, I guess. And also, my mind's been going over time while you've been saying this as well, thinking about aphids when they're falling as well, and how that's got fishing tiny flies when they've been falling off trees and leaves and everything else, and how they've got me out of a jam as well. So they've been useful from that point of view. Also, what you were saying about fishing at shorter distance, and I think I've come around to, not that I've been a huge throw the line right up the river, but what I've been trying to get people to think about is you can get, with good wading, with patience, you can actually get really close to the fish if you're careful. And I think one of the podcasts I did with Paul Proctor, we talked about that, and how close, and having fished with him, you can see how close you can actually get. I like to get as close as I possibly can, because it means I'm getting a better drift in theory, aren't I? That it's the fly's drifting over a shorter period, and there's not a load of line on the water. There is, I'm not having to make a great long accurate cast up the water. I can get relatively close. It's much easier to hit that target first or second cast. So I think that's something to bear in mind for people as well, isn't it? See how close you can get to fish. Be patient. The other thing I was going to, coming back, because I still, as we've alluded to, is spotting the fish on the water. One of the things I've recommended in the past is having a bigger dry fly and using that to tie on the back the smaller fly so that you can spot that on the water. Have you got, as aside from the post colours or wing colours, is there anything else you would recommend, Andy, for people picking up their fly in harder conditions?
I guess part of it is just accept that maybe you are going to lose visual contact. I mean, that's one thing. I mean, beyond the materials, that range is going to be absolutely key, and particularly if there is busier water. I mean, I still fish tiny flies even in fairly busy water, but I think range is key. Or just accept that you are going to lose visual contact and have the confidence that, you know, if something rises or strikes within general distance, lift it into it and see what happens. But range is key. And it's interesting you say that, because I think catching a fish at close range and really close range, that just amplifies the whole experience further again. I mean, I'm very stealthy. It was sort of drummed into me because of what I was reading. I was coming into this as a fisherman, but learning how to fly fish. So I read an awful lot of books, and that whole idea of stealth is something that I kind of really took on very seriously. And I would argue, possibly the first 5 years I was out fly fish, when I was learning with that experience, I was actually a much better fisherman, because I had all this raw sort of knowledge that I'd picked up from the books that I was trying to apply. And I was literally heron-like. And I think as time has gone on, I've maybe become a little bit more relaxed and a little bit more complacent. I'm not saying I kind of sort of jumping around the place, but those first 5 years, it was like proper fishing. And I probably need to get back to that. That's the idea that you're approaching a pool, you're observing, and you'll spend half an hour just sort of sussing things out, getting into position before you even, you know, make your first cast. Whereas now I'm tending to head out to catch just one trout. That's sort of always been my mantra, just go out to catch just one trout, but I know where I'm going and I know what to expect, and maybe you're a little bit more blasé in terms of your approach. I mean, in terms of experience, that's always been my aim, if you can sort of fish and do all this, but do it at close range. But in the last couple of years, just in terms of really learning what that can potentially mean, there's a stretch of water fairly close to here called Bushside. I'll mention it because it's known, it's a popular stretch of water. There's some fantastic pools, and if you get the conditions right, the fishing can be great. There are some decent sized fish, but we tend to work in probably, I would say, the 8 to 14 inch sort of category. But there's this one section between two pools, and I was working up this one particular day, and there was just literally this glide moving between two sort of banks of weed. The only reason I presented a fly was because it just looked so pretty. The water was clear, it was moving quite fast, the conditions were perfect, and I just presented a fly because I just thought, if you were to catch a fly at that particular spot, how wonderful would that be? And literally, I was stood. I mean, this thing was literally off the tip root. There's literally inches of fly line. And I just literally dabbed a fly, and out of nowhere, this honest 12-inch brown just came out of nowhere, hit the fly. All hell broke loose because the water was moving very quickly this way. It was sort of a fairly sort of small area. But it just highlighted to me just how close you can get to a trout. And I did walk several years later through the exact same spot, remembered what had happened, and did exactly the same thing again. And another similar sized trout came out and took the fly. And it very much reminded me, you can literally be standing over these things, and as long as you're sort of careful in your approach, and I say it just magnifies the whole experience so much further. I mean, just literally lifting into a trout with nothing but essentially your leader and tippet is just thrilling, and it's happened to me several times, and on very small streams as well. And it's maybe a reason I stick to the small streams. There's less for me to work out on a small stream. I don't do a lot of travelling. I've spent some really nice time with Mark and Chris up in the northwest.
Oh yes, absolutely, yes,
guys. It's the only winter fishing I've done. I only caught my first grayling working with Chris through some streams in the northwest, sort of around the Clitheroe area. But I always found with bigger streams, I just look at them and I think, I just don't know where to start. And yes, you can break it all down and apply what you know. But for me, even a medium-sized river is just a little bit overwhelming. But a small stream, I can work it all out very, very quickly. And that's why I've always stuck to it. And when I say you can have so much fun from these small streams, and they're all around me, it's within sort of very easy distance, and there's just so much joy and pleasure and peace to be found on these small streams. I've just never been drawn to sort of big water and big fish. I mean, big trout frighten the life out of me. I mean, I tend to do a lot of my fishing with Roy Christie. And I think he's never really quite understood. I mean, I've lost some good fish, always my own fault, bad knots and what have you, and he'll sort of look at me as I'm sort of chuckling to myself. I mean, my personal best is still in the stream. It never made it to hand. And again, an above average trout on a small stream is good fun, and it can go a bit crazy as well because you've got so limited space. And I'm quite protective of my bamboo fly rod as well, so I'm maybe not giving it as much stick as maybe as I could. But say all of that reinforces the small streams and the small flies. And I should maybe venture out a little bit more. I do visit a couple of still waters. Still water's not really my thing, and it's just the lack of movement. That's all it is. It's just not as dynamic. I mean, the few times I've been out, I've just kind of cast out and thought, this isn't a million miles from the sort of fishing I used to do. It's sort of a little bit, it's more static. It's almost a case of cast and weight. But no, I think certainly this year it'll be more of the small streams, but maybe just be a bit more adventurous and maybe a bit more observant as well. I probably need to get back to that idea, because when you do have the discipline, it always works. And by that, I mean, find that pool. 20 minutes can seem like a long time when you're doing nothing but observing. But take that time to really just observe castorizing trout and approach it that way. So I might just sort of further distill the whole thing in this comment.
I think you're right. The patience thing is really important. Sometimes I'll sit and smoke a cigar, or I'll sit and chat with a friend, or I'll chat with my dog even, and wait for that moment. There's no doubt it pays dividends. There's no doubt about that at all. So I wanted to come on to before, because I think we're going to have an interesting chat about tackle as well, but I wanted to come on to the tying aspect of flies. And you mentioned the Mariano hook. That was partridge, was it? That, yeah, that's partridge hook. And
yeah.
I guess patterns, if someone's thinking about it, a good place to start, something like an F-fly, I guess, is it? Or what would you recommend people consider tying as their first little fly in?
Yeah. That's a perfect recommendation, the Fflight. And interestingly, only in the last couple of years did I discover Hans Bauman's improved Fflight. It's a tricky one to tie to get it absolutely right, but it's as simple as it gets. And I say probably 24 is maybe a good place to sort of start, just to sort of cut your teeth. That said, the small hooks are fairly readily available. They've maybe been more available at some times in the past. But yes, just start with, and I guess the key thing is training your eyes. I wear glasses now for tying, which is something I never did. I had 20/20 vision for years. But if I am having a serious sort of tying session in the smaller stuff, I'll always start, just put a 32 in the vise, tie a fly, and then literally just unwrap it, and it just trains the eye in. When you then take a 32 out of the vise and put a 24 in, suddenly you have this expansive work area to play with. So visually, your mind is trained, and suddenly you can see a lot. I know a lot of people use the sort of various magnifying tools. I never have, beyond, as I say, more recently, a pair of specs. I just think it's more to do with sort of you're controlling your hand and eye coordination when things are magnified. To me, is not so great. But the key is, I say, just keep it simple. And the one rule I would always stick by is make every wrap count. And I mean every single wrap. When you're sort of getting down into sort of the tiny, not a single, what I call vanity wraps. I've always been really impressed by these guys who can literally almost sort of like a machine lay thread perfectly up and down at high speed. For me, in real terms, it's going to take me 10 minutes to tie a fly. Sometimes it can take 15 to 20, because I'll sit back, I'll observe, I'll sort of think about what I'm doing. I'm never in any rush. I mean, hats off to Gareth and the other guys that are production tyers. I just don't know how they do it. And maybe get a linen tester, and it's not to tie with, but it's to observe your work. So the linen testers are the little lenses. They're usually sort of 6x, and they're literally a linen tester. It was like linen guys used to basically test the weave of linen. They're a great cheap way to really just sort of study your work. And I would say develop that obsession with making every single wrap count. And apply the Hans Bauman thought of basically tying at the eye, work your way down as you're tying everything in, and then work your way back up the shank. Albeit these are very simple flies. Probably the most complex thing I do at the real small scale is that thing I call a cluster shuck. But that was an exercise in itself in how, working with the TMC 518 32 hook, can I load multiple triggers on what is essentially the smallest commercially available hook. But even then, it's still quite refined in terms of it's very, very sparse. And that to me is key with all fly tying. It's sparse. I can only speak in terms of my own personal experience and local waters, but generally the natural world in terms of fly life is pretty sparse. It is pretty skinny, and I love replicating that. It's one of the reasons I'm a big fan of the spinner stage. Those long, slender bodies. The long tails are helpful with a small fly. Spinners, the tails can be 3-4 times the length of the body, so that affords you a little bit of, I guess, flexibility. But no, just strip it right back. And the other point I would make, maybe in terms of less the design, because I've never designed a fly. Everything I do borrows from what's already been done. But I think in terms of very small flies, I think once you get to the sort of the 26s and below, the case for fishing subsurface isn't as great. And it's partly for me to do with the meniscus. The meniscus effect on a very small fly versus an 18, a 16 and a 14 is different. So I tend to fish surface with very, very small flies because they just sit very easily in the meniscus, and they're actually quite easy to keep floating as well. Often you don't even really need to treat them a great deal because it's just such a tiny piece of flotsam on the surface. So I would say, yeah, just stick to the surface flies, but just keep it simple and keep it natural looking. And that's another obsession for me. I have some sort of generic patterns that are used, and there's not a lot of them, and they're all focused, I guess, in terms of an engineering approach to how can I maintain something on the surface. But a lot of it is just stuff that looks natural. I'm slightly obsessed with that. I love cripples. I love that idea of a damaged cripple sitting in the surface. So they're all quite generic, and that's a big word I would use. Everything I do is drab, dull, skinny and sparse, very, very generic, but does look real natural. And that for me is the thing. And I think particularly at that scale, matching the hatchet size 32, you could do, but it's probably a little bit extreme. It's just about that very, very generic approach. And I think one of the reasons they're so successful, I can't help feeling when a trout is feeding and something very small and delicate floats over his head. It's a bit like fine dining. We can do the big clink hammers and they're so irresistible because it's like that sort of Big Mac and fries. You can't help yourself. But at the other end of the spectrum, if you go really, really small, it's just like some very fine morsel just passed. And I think that is part of the strike response. It wasn't last season, it would have been the season before. There's a local stream I fish it's a tiny micro stream. It was basically a drainage ditch, and Roy Christie rebuilt it in the 70s and the 80s by just moving rocks around. So this thing is, at the right times, is just sort of blissful. But we were fishing a pool and there was 14, 16 caddies fluttering everywhere, and the trout were on them. So my immediate response was to cast a 26 sort of very generic crippled midge type thing. Second cast there was a strike. Third cast there was a hookup. It bared no relationship to what was going on at the time. It was dramatically different to what the trout were keyed onto. But as I say, as soon as this tiny morsel was presented, I mean, it was just literally a 26 curved hook, black thread, a gold rib, and you can usually get sort of 6 or 8 turns nicely spaced and maybe tapered a little so it's tighter at the tip and sort of opening out. A wee poly wing and just a couple of wraps of badger hackle. This thing was pretty, and I will only cast a fly that's pretty. I literally look at it in my hand, and no, it's a pretty fly. It's a pretty fly, and I want to see it on the water. But the response was amazing. And then we have this strange 20 minutes where literally Roy and I just sort of sat down, like chuckling at each other, thinking, did that really just happen? As if to reinforce a point, So
it's interesting you mentioned. Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned about those pretty flies. And then I'm thinking about when you were saying when you were tying flies as well, because that's really important to me anyway, in the sense that you could sit and tie a fly quickly and rattle it off the vise and then put it in your fly box, but then you're out in the water and it doesn't look right. You're not going to use it, are you? And they just sit in the recesses of your fly box for eternity until you have the yearly fly box clear out, and that gets rejected, isn't it? So that thing that you said to me about sitting in your chair and looking at the fly a few times, and that's an important part of that process, actually, to ensure that it does make it to the final cut and makes it on the water as well, isn't it?
and it's part of the confidence as well, as I say. I mean, I wish I could chill out a bit and maybe be a bit more relaxed about the whole thing. But for me, fly fishing is, dare I say, primarily for me, it is an aesthetic pursuit. There is so much beauty in this sport and the places that we visit. You know, the rods and the reels, particularly the older English style simple reels that I use. For me, the whole thing is aesthetic. I would be a better caster if I wasn't so hung up on that kind of thing. So I would rather deliver a cast that's not as accurate but looked great than one that was absolutely bang on the money that maybe looked a bit sloppy. I mean, I certainly don't claim to be a caster. I've learned to be able to achieve what I need to achieve. And certainly on smaller streams, it's a little bit simpler in that you haven't got the distance factor to deal with. But no, it is. It's about the aesthetics, and there's just something magic about that idea of the fly and the look of a fly. I mean, over the years, I've tried various sort of different approaches in terms of creating what to me just looks sublimely pretty on the surface. And for me, that's always a wing that tilts backward in that classic sail sort of configuration. I'm a huge fan of parachute flies, but I tend not to tie them anymore, because to my eye, that sort of upright post, even though that parachute hackle is so effective, it just doesn't look quite as natural. So I tend to sort of bind hackle around the shank and then clip underneath. I almost never tie parachute flies anymore. And it's all because of the aesthetics. I mean, it's slightly absurd, but that really is the key for everything that I'm doing. And the bamboo fly rods as well. Yes, they are gorgeous to look at, but I just like the look of a bamboo fly rod casting and creating loops.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. I was thinking about, well, we're going to come on to the tackle aspect of it very, very shortly, but I was also thinking about the presentation aspect of it. And before we move on, I thought it might be interesting to ask about Tipit as well. And is there what sort of strength and diameter are you using before that will affect the performance of the fly on the water? Do you have any sort of tips or advice on that front?
Yeah, I would say the last 10 years I've probably stuck almost exclusively with ABR Stroft. Some people may have had their experience of the odd bad batch. I certainly have, and it's put a few people off that I speak with, but I pretty much stick with ABR Stroft. So I'm trying to think the diameter. It's the 0.8 diameter. I think it translates into about 2 pounds breaking strain. You can go lower. I found I never need to. It's a fairly limp Tipit. So all the way down to 32s, I would stick with that. So something that's rated sort of 2 pounds may sound a little bit heavy duty, but it's the right sort of diameter. And that's probably about as low as I go. You can do. I mean, Varivas. I've still got unopened packs of the Varivas. You know, the really, really fine is sort of when you're getting down into sort of a pound and possibly even a sub a pound. I know that's for the Japanese market, and it's the guys that are fishing sort of the long, very fine, basically catching goldfish. I mean, that is almost a sort of a scene in some parts of Japan, and taking this thing beyond, I would say, its logical conclusion. But in terms of practical, real-world fishing, you really need to go much below 2 pounds. And with a bit of care, 2 pounds breaking strain offers you an awful lot of flexibility on stream. With a bit of care, you know, you can land some decent trout even down at that scale. And I'd say it does have certainly the flexibility and the diameter that you can get a nice drift.
So we're going to move on to tackle, and I suspect I know where your answer will be, and mine's similar. That, you know, when we came out of lockdown, the first lockdown, I ran to the river with a bamboo rod and some AK best flies and caught some fish on dry flies, rising fish on dry flies, and I hope when we can fish again that it'll be something similar. My influence, I suspect, for using bamboo rods is similar to yours. Would I be right in saying that you've been greatly influenced by the writing, and not just the writing, the approach to fishing by John Girac?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah. So I've got sort of all his books in terms of the bamboo. I mean, again, I was quite late to bamboo. I was using sort of fairly cheap graphite and learning what I was doing, and that worked really, really well. But then I started reading Giracs essays. I've read the Splitting Cane book, where Ed Engel actually meets with rod builders, and they're more sort of essays. And that's a magical book. Even if you're not necessarily that interested in fishing bamboo, it's a really good book to read, just to understand the craft and the history of the thing. And it was actually Nicholas Dallin out in Sweden, who many years ago, because I used to sort of bump into him at the fly shows and what have you, said, "Why on earth don't you fish bamboo? It's kind of the missing part of the jigsaw for you." But at that stage, I wasn't actually that bothered about tackle. I was very much focused on sort of learning the craft and learning stream craft and really learning how to, I guess, improve my game in terms of fly fishing. It was a bit later then I started thinking, well, what actually are the tools that I'm sort of using? But no, the Girac books are brilliant. He does a good job of positioning it as basically something we should all have at least one bamboo fly rod, just for the experience. And there is cheap stuff out there. I mean, the first one I got it imported from China. I mean, it's not a great rod, but there are still times I would just get it out and cast it on the lawn just to remind myself of that feeling of first casting a bamboo fly rod, because I had cast bamboo coarse rods. I mean, in the 80s they were around. It was mainly fiberglass, and carbon was just sort of coming in. But I did have this heavy old cane coarse rod, which wasn't much fun. Whereas within fly rods, it's a very, very different thing. These things are magical. It's just a very, very natural material. I just like the organic nature of it, and I try not to bang on about it too much, because it's, you know, we know technically what you can achieve with a whole range of other materials, but I've almost got to the stage now, if I'm not fishing my bamboo fly rod, it almost kind of feels like I'm not really fishing, and that might sound a bit silly, but I just don't have the same relationship with the carbon and glass rods I have. The Hardy Allen is a little bit different. That's just a unique little piece of kit that I got for a particular type of water. But it's always bamboo, albeit it's a hassle bamboo. It is. It takes long to put together. There's more care. I can't just sort of throw it into the back of the van and head to the stream. But I think it's worth it. I think it is worth it. And I hope those rods I had two built by Gary Marshall in Derby, but I'll certainly be looking after them, and hopefully the kids will pass them to their kids as well. Because certainly I've done very well on records in terms of hand-me-downs from the family. But no one was handing me down a bamboo fly rod, unfortunately.
Have you played with glass at all? The reason I ask is that I'm sort of flirting with that as a bamboo fan as well. And I put a message into Adam Rawson actually the other day, which I've got a reply to, and I'm really considering playing with one of those for some of the smaller streams as well. And is that something you play with? And what would you say as a comparison? Because to me, the fast glass, I remember fishing a glass rod, dear me, 15 years ago, and we just put so many lines on it and we couldn't make the thing work. I'm not going to say who the brand was, but I couldn't make the thing work, and it put me off for years. And now this fast glass sounds really, really interesting to me. Is that something you played with and tried?
Yeah, I like glass, and had I not spent what I've spent on my bamboo, I would probably just stick with a fiberglass fly rod, because they're so tough. That's the beauty of glass. It's so tough, and you can create a very bamboo-like feel. I'm maybe not such a fan of the faster stuff, whether it's carbon, bamboo, or glass. I did have a Hardy Jet 7'4" weight. Some people love them. I didn't. I just found there was no feel. It did what it did, and I had it for a couple of years, and I sort of sold it on. One glass rod that I did have that I sold on, which I kind of wish I haven't, it's one of the old Fen, I think it's Fen glass. This was a 7.5-foot 5-weight, brilliant streamer rod. Not that I fish a lot of streamers, but as say on those few occasions where the 14 Mustad Thunder Creeks come out, it was sweet. But it was at a time when I was trying to sort of streamline things. So this conversation would be very different had I never discovered bamboo. I think I would probably just fish a glass rod exclusively. And the main thing is it's just so tough. Because I do sometimes you do get a little bit concerned when you're sort of with a bamboo fly rod. You know, if you break a tip off one of those, it's an expensive replacement job. But no, I'm a big fan of it, and it's how pretty much I learned to fish. My first ever fishing rod. It was a stick of a thing, but that was fiberglass, just a solid lump of fiberglass, and it's strong as well. And one of the things that I don't always do, but maybe should do more, that I was taught, and again it's sort of a Roy Christie thing, is get the fishing quick. And I think I would probably have a little bit more confidence with glass than I'm slightly overprotective of my bamboo, if I'm honest. It's a strong material. You know, what is it? High tensile strength and steel when it's put together as a bamboo fly rod. But I am a little bit protective. They're not arrow straight. The rod I use mainly. There's a few. I wouldn't say it's a set. It isn't a set yet, but I kind of quite like that. There's a bit of history and a bit of there's a bit of work gone into that rod now. I did put a set in my first, say, this cheap Chinese rod, and that was last day of the season, probably 6 or 7 years ago. In a very tiny stream, hit a 14-inch trout in very small, confined space, managed to bring it to hand. But at the end of it all, the fish was released, and I just looked down the rod and I could see this slight set, and I've never been happier to put a set in a rod, thanks to that trout.
It's one of the things.
But I would be interested to hear about your rods, Pete, because I know you've got a fantastic collection of cane. I'd be interested, particularly the Mike Clark.
Yes, I do.
I think
I'm very, very lucky that, well, I fished them. It was interesting you talk about the sets, because I always think, and I fish my Mike Clark as well, it's not sort of put on show, that everything gets fished, and it should do, and so I enjoy it. And I always think when I'm playing a fish that I rotate the rod round as I'm playing it as well, to try and avoid that set. And like you, I'd be really sad, particularly in that, if I put a set in it as well. But I was extremely lucky that, like you, a huge fan of bamboo, and I've got some Luke Bannister rods which I think are outstanding. He does a faster one, a super fast, but he has a Leonard taper which I think's beautiful. And I fished with him one time, and they were fishing the super fasts, and I had the Leonard, and I said, "Oh, this is so good." And he said, "I forgot how good this was, that he'd not fished it in a while." And I got a Eden cane from Bernard Ramnuscus, who again's in splitting cane, and that's nodeless. So he took the nodes, the growth joints out of the bamboo rods, and that's a phenomenal rod. Absolutely. It's an 8 foot for a 5, but I fish a 4-weight on it, and it's absolutely beautiful. And the Mike Clark is a wonderful, wonderful, incredibly lucky story that it was my 40th, and my wife had got in touch with Mike and Kathy and had saved up and ordered me the rod. And on my 40th, she told me, and then she said, "Best you go out and collect it." And I'm not ashamed to admit, I just burst into tears. And I went with my friend Ray, and we went to Mike's shop, and we stayed in Lyons. And if you've read John Girack's book, you'll know there's some rain that runs through Lyons. We went and collected the rod, and we cast it. And there were some other people hanging around the shop, and we cast them out there, and it was fantastic. And then they shut here. Mike and AK came down as well, so we hung out with AK Best and was incredibly lucky there. Wow. And then he shut the shop in the afternoon, and we fished the St. Vrain, which was amazing. And then the next day we'd had such a good day, didn't open the shop, and we fished the whole day. And they took us a secret spot, and we fished there. And that's a phenomenal rod. And Emma said, "Look, you're in the order list." And I said, phone him up, and I was incredibly nervous about speaking to him on the phone, and he was a super great guy. And I said, just whatever you would like, build your typical rod. So it's an 8 foot 5 weight rod, 3 piece,
Yeah.
and I fish that a lot, and it's just beautiful. And it's his typical rod, and is absolutely phenomenal. So I'm incredibly lucky. I enjoy them. They're not investments. That rod means a hell of a lot to me, and I enjoy it and fish it. And it is part of what you say
Yeah.
of the pleasure of the fishing, the aesthetics, whatever it may be. And again, coming back to Girac, the part of where he says, using graphite rods like typing on a word processor, bamboo rods is like using a fountain pen, and that's exactly right. And I cast better, I fish better, I just enjoy it,
Yeah.
every aspect of it. And I sort of moved away from it a little bit, but have come very firmly back. And even during this lockdown, as in the previous one, I've had my bamboo rods out there and casting them, just getting ready, getting the sense and the feel of it. And that's part of it, isn't it? It is a much bigger picture part of it. It's not just the fish for me, it's everything that goes with it, the friendships, the stuff you're using, how you're going to use it is a really important part of it for me. And that's why it's been so cool talking to you today, because I know you feel the same way. And that stripped back term again is, I know, something you subscribe to. And I think, we don't need so much paraphernalia with us. We don't need a whole load of flies. Things like that aren't going to change our lives. And what you were saying about drab flies is really rings true with me, that we don't need a whole lot of patterns or the latest materials. Those patterns are still working as good as they've ever done, really, haven't they?
No, absolutely. And it's funny you mentioned the casting. I mean, I would argue I probably cast a carbon rod better than bamboo. People often say that sort of bamboo is more forgiving. I kind of feel it's the other way round, but I like the work that I have to put in to make bamboo work for me. Because rest assured, I mean, fortunately, most of my fishing, I'm on my own. You do have to kind of tune in. There's days where it's just not happening, and the harder you fight against bamboo, the worse it gets. I mean, it can get very, ugly. But then it suits bamboo suits my casting stroke. I've always just naturally had a very laid back, slow casting stroke, and it's one of the reasons I avoided sort of the faster tapers. I mean, when I sort of sat down with Gary Marshall, a bit like your conversation with Mike Clark, he said, what sort of thing you're looking for? And I said, well, look, what do you do the most of? What are you the happiest doing? And it's the Everett Garrison tapers. I mean, the man can turn his hand to anything. If you give him the taper, he can reproduce it. But it's the Garrison tapers that he does a lot on. So that for me took away a lot of the decision making. Did a bit of research. Everett Garrison was an engineer. His tapers are from empirical data, and if you look at the book, you can see the graphs. You can see how this was worked out. And I just thought, well, that takes away some of the decision making for me. He was an engineer. These tapers are empirically derived to do a particular function. Just stick with Everett and, let fine cane do what fine cane does, sort of building those rods.
So you mentioned, when you were talking about your home water, you mentioned Colorado. Have you been out there fishing as well? Have you managed to fish some of the streams out there and Ed's home water on the South Platte?
No, unfortunately not. Unfortunately not. There's an open invitation from Ed to join him that's existed for several years now, and I've just not got round to it. And I don't know whether I will. I don't know whether I will get round to it. It's certainly a part of the world I would love to see. I was never sort of drawn to the big sort of trout meccas like sort of New Zealand and what have you, but certainly Colorado, and probably not even the big rivers. Just head out to those small streams. In Trout Lessons, there's a whole chapter on fishing small streams and reading maps and sort of discovering water. So that's very much the kind of thing that I'd like to do. And I've got some really nice photographs on file that Ed sent over the years of the kind of places that never make his blog or his books or what have you. So that's kind of the thing I would like to do. Just sort of take my bamboo fly rod, head out into the hills. Bit nervous about bears, if I'm honest. Ed's a very accomplished outdoorsman. But no, I mean, I would love to do it someday. But I say I don't travel an awful lot with fishing. I tend to stick to these sort of very local home waters.
And that brings us round really nicely, doesn't it, about home water and what home water means to us. And, you know, like I was saying at the beginning, it kind of feels that I wonder that there will be more appreciation of what's right on your doorstep. Yet, I guess when we're allowed to travel more freely, we'll want to travel. I know Emma and I want to head to Scotland, swing flies for salmon. There's lots of other things that we'd like to do. But even last year made me realise my home water, how much I love it. And I barely fished anywhere else. I fished the Tor bar probably 3 or 4 other times, not a lot. The Tor had everything I wanted and delivered everything I wanted and more, I think. And I wonder if we will get this appreciation of what we have and how lucky we are to actually have it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I'm very spoiled here. It's literally walking distance to the river bush that goes through the village. And I say, I don't know. I won't even try and estimate, but there's miles and miles and miles of feeders and tributaries that are unexplored and probably unfished. I do spend quite a bit of time down on the west coast of Ireland. So there's a village called Easkey. It's basically a surfers hangout, has been forever. But the Easkey Loch, very similar to here, the Easkey Loch feeds into the main Easkey River, but then you have all these tributaries. So over the years, I have spent quite a bit of time looking at those tributaries. Less pollution and litter that we have because it's an unpopulated space, but very much applying sort of what I would do here on very similar waters. I have fished the Easkey Loch, but all I did literally casting probably 15 to 25 feet along the margins on a day when guys had their sort of 10-foot 8 weights and doing some amazing long casts. I was just skipping around the margins and picking off 8-9 inch wild brown trout with a small fly and a short rod in the margins. So yes, I do need to travel more this year, but it will be very much a case of doing what I always do and just finding how that fits in different sort of environments, I guess. But no, very lucky here in terms of the river bush. I mean, the river bush historically was known as one of the finest salmon fisheries in the world. You know, if you go back to the 40s and the 50s, it was serious. But they built the dam. There's been a lot of development. There's a certain amount of water abstraction. The water quality in places isn't great. And I'll be careful what I say, but, you know, we pay our permit, we pay our license each year. The way that money's spent is probably causing more damage than it's causing good. I would rather the money was just put in the bank if I'm absolutely honest. So it tends to be the tributaries where you have to kind of create your own fishery and move a few rocks around and what have you, because it is deteriorating fast. And I don't know if it's something that you're seeing, Pete, but we're finding year on year now the floods are higher and more sporadic. The droughts are longer and lower. There's more water being taken out of the system. There's more sort of runoff entering the system. And the litter in places, particularly if you're close to a road, is heartbreaking. And then you get a flood and it sort of lifts it up the bank. And what we have big problems with is the sort of the black plastic agricultural waste. As levels drop and roots are exposed, you just see this sort of huge amount of plastic that just slowly disappears over years and years and years. So the streams aren't, I don't want to sort of paint too bleak a picture, but the streams aren't in great condition here. I watch a lot of the guys on Instagram and what have you. I mean, some of what Gareth gets to fish in Wales is just spectacular and looks to be fairly well preserved and not necessarily immune to agriculture and what have you, but seems in good condition. As I say, all I can see at the moment is deterioration, and it's a shame because there are more houses being built, there are more trees being cut down. So all of the natural habitat. I mean, I've seen it certainly in the last 10 years. There are places that used to be idyllic, stuffed full of fish with some big fish that now just aren't what.
Yeah,
what they
it's
were,
interesting
unfortunately.
what you say about Wales as well, because I know the pollutions, and having spoken to Stefan on here, the pollution has been a big issue for a fair number of
Mm,
those streams over there. So that's been a worrying factor. And like you say, the concern,
mm,
and I was talking to a friend about it the other day, and these wet winters now, and the amount of rain, and like you say, the damage that's been done, the
mm,
erosion. You know, I've not been down to where I fish. I can't now for a little bit,
mm,
but I'd be interested to see how that looks now. And I worry about the erosion there, and like you say about reds and everything else that goes with it. It's a worry, and I think all we can do is our part of the deal in, like you say, making people aware of pollution incidents, clearing up that litter. We shouldn't have to do that, but we end up doing it. And I know the podcast I did with Matthew Wright, we
no.
talked about that, and he said he takes a black bag with him and just picks up the litter as he goes, which I know we try and do something
Mm,
similar as well. So
yeah.
I think if we can do our part of it and see if we're within a cycle, or if it is a trend, a worrying trend that we may have to contend with in the future. But
Mm.
I think all we can do is our bit, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, we're disconnected from nature in general. I see it amongst kids now. I mean, I don't fish in the village so much, but when I do, I mean, I've offered, come in, come and have a go. Don't throw your litter. The kids aren't really that bothered, and that's where fly fishing is so important. And I think the kind of fly fishing that you and I and so many of your listeners enjoy, the sort of small streams, that connection and valuing the natural world, because yeah, it's under pressure. It's under serious pressure from multiple angles. Let's be honest. But no, we've lost that just sort of appreciation of the natural world, and I mean, we shouldn't need to preserve it. Nature is brilliant at preserving itself. You just don't need to sort of corrupt it necessarily. But as I say, it's well, who knows? I'm optimistic, but also very realistic. And I think unless we've got more young people getting into fly fishing locally and taking personal responsibility for the condition of the water and the banks and what have you, it's probably going to deteriorate, if I'm honest. But there's a lot of water out there, and I can look at my OS map and not lose too much sleep, because even if certain areas start to deteriorate, rest assured there's plenty of stuff I can find that is pretty untouched. Not least that 3/4 of a mile of water I've up to find
Lovely.
to go and
Well,
explore.
we've chatted well over an hour now, and I could go on. I think by the sound of it, the pair of us could keep on talking for quite some time. I'm going to end it with a question for you. Really, really simple one. I think I probably know the answer. What are your hopes for 2021 from a fishing perspective? What are you hoping to do?
Certainly hope we can get out. And all I'm probably looking for is maybe 2 or 3 days between the 1st of March and the 20th of October, when our season closes, where not necessarily it's the biggest fish, but there'll be bamboo fly rods, there'll be small flies, there'll be trout found in almost impossible lies that I'll study, I'll work out my approach, and it'll happen. And that's all I'm hoping for this year. I would like some of the boom at the earlier start of the season, and maybe a larger than average trout. Some nice warm days through the summer where maybe the fishing isn't so great, but certainly fishing into the evening can be fun. And I would like that autumnal thing, which I didn't really get this year, where the water is a little bit fuller but clear. It's a bit crisper in the air. They're having that last feeding rush before the season closes, but still using sort of the small fly approach. So I reckon 2 to 3 good days this year would
Perfect. That
probably
sounds
do me.
absolutely perfect. Andy, if people want to look at the pictures, read the words on the small fly funk, where do they find you?
Probably Instagram's the easiest at the moment. None of it gets an awful lot of traffic at the moment, but Small Fly Funk, or at Small Fly Funk at Instagram. The blog's still there, and if you just search Small Fly Funk, you'll find it. Both of those were never anything more than a means for me to catalogue stuff. So I tend not to use hashtags. some of the content's better than other of the content. And certainly if you look at the Instagram, it features more than just fly fishing. There's a lot of music. I mean, I'm playing a lot of music this year because of sort of lockdown and what have you, and I'm mixing quite a lot of music again, which I haven't done. But I would say probably Instagram's the easiest one, and you can find the blog.
Perfect. Andy, thanks so much for being a guest on the podcast today. It's been really inspirational to listen to somebody talk so passionately about an aspect, those smaller flies, and it's inspired me certainly to fish those a whole lot more. So can I thank you so much for being a guest on the Fly Culture podcast?
Thank you, Pete.
I reckon we should do it on the water
sometime. Do it again sometime. Absolutely. I need to organise maybe a UK tour, because you're down south, you've got Gareth in Wales, there's my mate Mark and Jim up in Lanark, Pale Watery. You know, Jim does the sort of the Pale Watery thing. So right across the UK, there's some great, and Andy, of course, Andy and I be in the Midlands. I'm a Midlands boy myself, so I sort of I know a little bit about the dove. So who knows? Maybe not this year, but maybe.
Fantastic, Andy. Thank you so much for being a guest on the Fly Culture podcast. I hope everyone's enjoyed listening to this one. Just, I guess, it's two guys talking about a passion, and hopefully it has inspired you to perhaps consider fishing some small flies at some stage. Thank you so much for listening to the Fly Culture podcast. Plenty more of those coming very, very soon.